Today we're going to be covering Chapter 11 of Propaganda, titled The Mechanics of Propaganda. If you want to follow along with my show notes without using the video, you can find them at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. If you like what I'm doing, you can also find a donate button there. And if you want to help out without donating, you can do all the normal stuff: comment, subscribe, share, like, whatever. Now, if you are following along, you can see here that my notes are highlighted in light blue, and the things that I think are very important, are orange and yellow. And with all that out of the way, let's get started with Chapter 11 of Propaganda, The Mechanics of Propaganda. Bernays begins. There is no means of human communication which may not also be a means of deliberate propaganda, because propaganda is simply the establishing of reciprocal understanding between an individual and a group. The important point to the propagandist is that the relative value of the various instruments of propaganda and their relation to the masses are constantly changing. If he is to get full reach for his message, he must take advantage of these shifts of value the instant they occur. 50 years ago, the public meeting was a propaganda instrument par excellence. Today, it is difficult to get more than a handful of people to attend a public meeting unless extraordinary attractions are part of the program. The automobile takes them away from home. The radio keeps them in the home. The successive daily editions of the newspaper bring information to them in the office or the subway, and they are also sick of the ballyhoo of the rally. Instead, there are numerous other media of communication, some new, others old, but so transformed that they have become virtually new. The newspaper, of course, remains always a primary medium for the transmission of opinions and ideas, in other words, for propaganda. And today we can see this shift. The instruments have shifted to this digital landscape that we have today. Influencers specifically, but social media in general, have become the tip of the spear when it comes to disseminating propaganda. Things like podcasts, YouTube channels, and other similar things, they may fall outside of social media, but they are part of the same digital propaganda vectors. Finally, we have the streaming services that are largely replacing television, that are a third, less changed, prong in the propagandist array of weapons. And I think a really interesting note that I'll make here is that Bernays' great-nephew is a guy by the name of Mark Bernays Randolph. He is the co-founder and the first CEO of Netflix. So when we're talking about propaganda, maybe we should say the apple here does not fall far from the tree. Bernays continues, it was not many years ago that newspaper editors resented what they called the use of news columns for propaganda purposes. Some editors would even kill a good story if they imagined its publication might benefit anyone. This point of view is now largely abandoned. Today, leading editorial offices take the view that the real criterion governing the publication or non-publication of matter which comes to its desk is the news value. The newspaper cannot assume, nor is it its function to assume, the responsibility of guaranteeing that what it publishes will not work out to someone's interest. There is hardly a single item in any daily paper, the publication of which does not, or might not, profit or injure somebody. That is the nature of the news. What the newspaper does strive for is that the news which it publishes shall be accurate, and, since it must select from the mass of news material available, that it should be of interest and importance to a large group of readers. Now here I would say that, while it's reasonable to expect some news might help or harm certain parties, there's even some old quote about it's only news if someone doesn't want it published, something like that. But the newspapers today, they have no qualms about publishing only that which fits their particular narrative that they have crafted for their audience. Even today, in 2024, years after Trump's first successful presidential campaign, you can still see these Russia collusion and Russian hacker stories that have been basically completely falsified, but you hear them still over and over again because that's the propaganda, right? It worked. lots of people believe these things, even though they're completely baseless. Now, when Twitter was kind of an echo chamber of liberal thought, the news agencies lauded it. You saw it all the time as a source for the news. But then after Elon Musk bought it, it became a lot more balanced. The same news agencies decried the death of democracy. And the problem isn't that this or that news might help or hurt someone. The problem is the news agencies get to pick and choose which stories are published. And if a story, like I said, supports their narrative, it gets published, even if it might not even be noteworthy or even accurate. On the other hand, there might be a bombshell story that is ignored because it paints the wrong picture. Again, think about things like the Hunter Biden laptop that simply wasn't covered, or the Panama Papers, or the Twitter files. Lots of this bombshell news comes out, and the news agencies simply dismiss it. It's like a tree falling in the woods and no one's around. Does it make a sound? If a bombshell news story happens, but none of the major news agencies cover it, does anybody know? Bernays continues. In its editorial columns, the newspaper is a personality, commenting upon things and events from its individual point of view. But in its news columns, the typical modern American newspaper attempts to reproduce, with due regard to news interest, the outstanding events and opinions of the day. And again, here I'm going to argue that the news interest is no longer even remotely relevant. The reproduction is of the opinions, not of the day, but of the audience. If you tune into CNN versus Fox News, they might be talking about the same sort of things, but the news stories selected are going to be tailored for their audience. And I say here that the goal is to create an echo chamber where nothing is questioned and everything is simply taken as fact, accepted by the authority of the news station. Bernays continues. It does not ask whether a given item is propaganda or not. What is important is that it be news. And in the selection of news, the editor is unusually entirely independent. In the New York Times, to take an outstanding example, news is printed because of its news value and for no other reason. The Times editors determine with complete independence what is and what is not news. They brook no censorship. They are not influenced by any external pressure, nor swayed by any values of expediency or opportunism. And I flat out say that this is laughable in 2024 and has been laughable for at least several decades now. The New York Times, particularly, as the example he quotes, is a joke of a newspaper when it used to be the paper of record. It's nothing more than a modern-day Pravda. It parrots the establishment talking points, it censors like a duck to water, and it certainly is pressured and swayed and acts strongly, opportunistically, when given the chance. Bernays continues. If the Public Relations Council can breathe a breath of life into an idea and make it take its place among other ideas and events, it will receive the public attention it merits. There can be no question of his contaminating news at its source. He creates some of the day's events, which must compete in the editorial office with other events. Often the events which he creates may be specially acceptable to a newspaper's public, and he may create them with that public in mind. I think this part is quite important. We see how Bernays here is nonchalantly talking about how the propagandist creates events, and he may even specifically tailor these events to a newspaper's audience. You might see this today in things like TikTok and YouTube Shorts style videos that are created to cater towards a particular low attention span audience. You might also host an event and create many short videos to promote it. Again, this isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Someone might be hosting a convention and they want to spread the word about it. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we apply it to political and cultural ideas, a deluge of short videos can literally change the course of a nation. And the propagandists, while they might, let's say, create a series of videos that garner attention, and these videos might be promoted by YouTube and Facebook, often working hand in glove with the propagandists. But then what happens next is regular people see these quote-unquote successful videos, and they emulate those successful propaganda videos, and before long the proverbial genie is out of the bottle, and the memes that come out of it are changing culture. You don't necessarily need everyone parroting a particular viewpoint to be, let's say, on the propagandist payroll. If the propagandist can get their story to the top of the headlines, other people might start talking about it just because they think it's popular. Bernays continues, the source of the news offered to the editor should always be clearly stated and the facts accurately presented. And this one, again, has set sail a long time ago. But today we get flat out lies, and we get a lot of these anonymous sources within the organization. There's no sources whatsoever. They can literally just make things up. Whether they are or not, we can't tell because there's no actual source. So take our word for it. Trust me, bro. I'm not lying to you, even though I have every incentive financially and socially to lie to you. Bernays continues. The situation of the magazines at the present moment, from the propagandist point of view, is different from that of the daily newspapers. The average magazine assumes no obligation, as the newspaper does, to reflect the current news. It selects its material deliberately in accordance with a continuous policy. It is not, like the newspaper, an organ of public opinion, but tends rather to become a propagandist organ, propagandizing for a particular idea, whether it be good housekeeping or smart apparel or beauty and home decoration or debunking public opinion or general enlightenment or liberalism or amusement. One magazine may aim to sell health, another English gardens, another fashionable menswear, another Nietzschean philosophy. And I think this part here very much accurately describes our modern news landscape. It's much more opinionated, and it's much more a tool of the propagandist to promote a particular idea, or in modern parlance, a particular narrative. He says here that each publication has its own biases and propagandizes to and from that position. Again, I don't see any difference between what he's saying here about the magazines and what we see on, again, let's say CNN, Fox. It doesn't matter left or right. They're all garbage. Bernays continues. The lecture, once a powerful means of influencing public opinion, has changed its value. The lecture itself may be only a symbol, a ceremony. Its importance, for the propaganda purposes, lies in the fact that it was delivered. Professor so-and-so, expounding an epoch-making invention, may speak to 500 persons, or only 50. His lecture, if it is important, will be broadcast. Reports of it will appear in the newspapers. Discussion will be stimulated. The real value of the lecture, from the propaganda point of view, is in its repercussion to the general public. The radio is at present one of the most important tools of the propagandist. Its future development is uncertain. Newspapers have recognized the advertising potentialities of the companies that manufacture radio apparatus and the radio stores, large and small, and newspapers have accorded to the radio in their news and featured columns an importance relative to the increasing attention given by the public to the radio. At the same time, certain newspapers have bought radio stations and linked them with their news and entertainment distribution facilities, supplying these two features over the air to the public. Now, what we see here is like using an old media, let's say newspapers in this case, to promote the new media, radios. This doesn't feel particularly propagandistic to me. I mean, it is, but I think that the people would be inclined to gravitate towards the new, let's say, superior product in this case. And yes, they are pushing a product, but again, I think that the radio and then the television and then the internet are such massive game changers that, again, people would have naturally adopted them. Kind of like when I mentioned before, you don't need to propagandize people into brushing their teeth when they can see the results of those around them, of the good benefits of brushing your teeth. You don't need to really propagandize people into pushing these new forms of communication. Again, let's say social media today. It is very valuable to the average person. The network effect is large. Everyone's on social media, so people want to be on there. You didn't need any kind of concentrated effort to convince people to join things like Facebook. Bernays continues, large groups, political, radical, sectarian, economic, or professional, are tending to control stations to propagandize their points of view. And again, we see here that even from the early days, these monopolies were growing up around radio. And I would say then also newspapers, television, internet, you see them everywhere. Clear Channel in the United States owns, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's most of the broadcast stations. I think the Murdochs own most of Australian media in general. If you look at the book publishers, like I said, the radio, television, movies, streaming, they're all owned by a handful of companies. Bernays continues, the American motion picture is the greatest unconscious carrier of propaganda in the world today. It is a great distributor for ideas and opinions. The motion picture can standardize the ideas and habits of a nation because pictures are made to meet the market demands. They reflect, emphasize, and even exaggerate broad popular tendencies rather than stimulate new ideas and opinions. The motion picture avails itself only of ideas and facts which are in vogue. As the newspaper seeks to purvey news, it seeks to purvey entertainment. I would say that this is only partially true. The movies are certainly still pushing propaganda. That's obvious. But they, A, are no longer the greatest carrier of propaganda. Again, I would say that the internet and specifically social media has supplanted movies. And B, while he says that they are a distributor of ideas and they can only emphasize and exaggerate tendencies rather than to stimulate new ideas and opinions, I think that's inaccurate. They most certainly can stimulate new ideas and opinions alongside their standardizing habits of a nation. I'm again reminded of that old quote, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? And I think it kind of, those are both accurate. Now, I personally used to argue that television, and when I say television, I mean it in all of its flavors, whether it's streaming or Netflix or you're watching a DVD, that's all kind of television to me. I used to argue that that was the most destructive invention that mankind has ever known. Now I would say that the internet and social media is on its way to supplanting television, but in both cases I think the destruction wrought is greater than all of history's wars put together. By sapping hours, and I think the average screen time is about 7 hours per day in the United States, every day, people never reach their full potential. They spend 7 hours a day. Even if half of that is, let's say, legitimate work, you're still spending 3.5 hours a day in front of a screen for what we might call entertainment purposes. This also has a bunch of other negative consequences besides the fact that you're being propagandized. It leads to a sedentary life. You're sitting there on the couch or wherever, and that comes with all its own physical and mental ailments. While all of the wounds of war were more explicit, you could see someone died in battle or they had their leg shot off or something like that. The wounds of television are much more subtle, but I think even worse because they seemingly never end. Like the war comes to an end eventually, but the TV just every night. However many billions of people around the world are watching it, the damage is almost incalculable. Bernays continues, another instrument of propaganda is the personality. Has the device of the exploited personality been pushed too far? President Coolidge, photographed on his vacation in full Indian regalia, in company with full-blooded chiefs, was the climax of a greatly over-reported vacation. Obviously, a public personality can be made absurd by misuse of the very mechanism which helped create it. Yet the vivid dramatization of personality will always remain one of the functions of the Public Relations Council. The public instinctively demands a personality to typify a conspicuous corporation or enterprise. And we see this today, and it's gone much further than I think what Bernays would have ever imagined. Today, the celebrities will do so much to stay in the spotlight, so much more than dressing up in Indian regalia. Although today I think dressing up that way might be politically incorrect, cultural appropriation. But we see the rise of things like OnlyFans and whatnot, and the celebrity sex tape. I think the exploitation of personality has been pushed very far. And honestly, I can't imagine it slowing down anytime soon. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw things like, public execution or, Colosseum-like games eventually in our depraved world. Bernays continues, there is a story that a great financier discharged a partner because he had divorced his wife. But what, asked the partner, have my private life affairs to do with the banking business? If you are not capable of managing your own life, was the reply, the people will certainly believe that you are not capable of managing their money. The propagandist must treat personality as he would treat any other objective fact within his province. Now, I think today this would almost never happen, at least for this reason. Although we do cancel people for what I might call wrongthink or past actions that were not taboo then but are taboo now, there seems to be really little rhyme or reason to who gets canceled. I remember Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, he dressed up in blackface, and while he caught some flack for it, he wasn't canceled. Again, I suspect here that's because he's towing the globalist line, right? But there are comedians that are canceled sometimes for jokes that they made a decade ago when the joke was perfectly reasonable, but today it's seen as, again, not politically correct. It's interesting here, I guess my point is, to see that you might fire someone, even a high-level partner at a bank, because they divorced their wife, for no other reason than, if you can't manage your family affairs, how are you going to manage my money? Heck, today we could probably see a banker, murder a prostitute and get a promotion. Bernays continues, a personality may create circumstances as Lindenberg created goodwill between the United States and Mexico. Events may create a personality, as the Cuban War created the political figure of Roosevelt. It is often difficult to say which creates the other. There are a multitude of other avenues of approach to the public mind, some old, some new, as television. The school may disseminate information concerning scientific facts. The fact that a commercial concern may eventually profit from a widespread understanding of its activities because this does not condemn the dissemination of such information, provided that the subject merits study on part of the students. If a baking corporation contributes pictures and charts to a school to show how bread is made, these propaganda activities, if they are accurate and candid, are in no way reprehensible, provided the school authorities accept or reject such offers carefully on their educational merits. Now, I think this is a real slippery slope. The charts might be perfectly reasonable, but placing the essentially advertisement in the school, I can't really put my finger on it, but I'm going to say it just rubs me the wrong way. It would really kind of, I think, create a potential market where the companies were competing to get this prime advertising real estate right in the schools, a truly captive audience. They would push the envelope with what they could get away with, less educational, more entertaining in this race to the bottom. The students would be merely an afterthought next to their profit seeking. I really can't see any other way that would play out. I was at the doctor recently, the dentist, and while I was waiting for them to come in, all over the walls were basically advertisements for different toothpastes and whatnot. And they gave me like a coupon for a mouthwash they recommended to me. And I was wondering, where did those come from? The doctor didn't go out and find them. Some salesperson came to the dentist office and said, hey, we're going to give you these free samples. And is the dentist getting some kind of a kickback? I don't know, but that feels like a conflict of interest to me. Bernays continues. Undoubtedly, the public is becoming aware of the methods which are being used to mold its opinions and habits. If the public is better informed about the processes of its own life, it will be so much more receptive to the reasonable appeals to its own interest. No matter how sophisticated, how cynical the public may become about the publicity methods, it must respond to the basic appeals because it will always need food, crave entertainment, long for beauty, and respond to leadership. If the public becomes more intelligent in its commercial demands, commercial firms will meet the new standards. If it becomes wary of the old methods used to persuade it to accept a given idea or commodity, its leaders will present their appeals more intelligently. And I think here the the need for food, craving, entertainment, etc. They're all kind of, I'd say, even borderline ridiculous examples of what is used to justify why the public, quote, must respond to the basic appeals of propaganda. Now, I've walked away from TV and movies well over a decade ago, and I never adopted social media in the first place. And I say this only because I don't feel my life is lacking in any way because I don't engage in those forms of media or communication. And that extra 7 hours a day, even if you say that half that is used for, let's say, legitimate screen time, that's 3.5 hours still, every day of the week, 7 days a week. So you're talking about 25 hours a week. And in that time, you can do whatever you want. Now, if you want to use the TV and social media when you're bored, I would say you simply need to find something that strokes your interest. I read nonfiction, I exercise, and I play a little bit of video games. That's a lesser vice, I admit, but I try to limit that to, 1 hour or so a day. Now, you would be surprised, you'd be shocked what you can accomplish if you set aside 1 hour a day dedicated to a particular goal. Again, in 1 month, 30 hours, heck, even 20 hours if you only do it Monday through Friday, you can accomplish a whole heck of a lot in 20 hours. And it's only an hour a day, just chipping away at it. Now, my suggestion here would be, this is beyond the topic of the book, but my suggestion would be shut the TV off and spend an hour a day doing anything that you're interested in. Literally anything is better than watching television. Bernays finishes off the chapter in the book with the following. Propaganda will never die out. Intelligent men must realize that propaganda is the modern instrument by which they can fight for their productive ends to help bring order out of chaos. And I see here that Bernays ends with a final jab at the intelligent versus unintelligent men. He never really says unintelligent, but it's implied strongly. And these really eerie comments on bringing order out of chaos. For those that aren't familiar, order out of chaos is the English translation from a Latin saying, ordo ab chaos, which is a Freemason term. Again, it means to bring order out of chaos. And I think this part here goes a lot deeper into conspiracy theories. But when we look at the chaos in the world around us, probably more so, in fact, guarantee more chaos today than when Bernays was writing this, we can see how a number of organizations are trying to bring their style of order via propaganda to the chaos. You might even get the feeling that there is some kind of manipulation going on here. And that's kind of my whole point in covering this book and the future works, that some people are trying to manipulate us culturally, socially, economically, etc., so that they can sort of create in their minds a utopian structure in the world. Now, some examples here we might see are, let's say, the United Nations, NATO, the BRICS, and I'd say they're all kind of jockeying or maybe even working together, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But these kinds of groups are working for regional control of the world. Consider how the European Union has forced its member states to accept wholesale the immigration that is, at this point, pulling their countries apart. The people clearly don't want this. If you go online to the various forums, whether it's left or right, people don't want this. Or at least the vast majority of people don't want this. And yet it continues. And what does it spread? Chaos. First, they weaken the nation, and finally it allows for some kind of a solution, the order, to be put in place that might never have been acceptable prior to the migrant crisis. It's kind of a Hegelian dialectic. They create a problem, and the people ask for some kind of a solution, and then, oh, well, we had this pre-made solution in the first place. What's that going to be? I mean, I can only speculate, but it does seem to me that there are some ulterior motives behind this immigration wave. Now, we also saw a similar thing on a truncated timeline during COVID. The chaos of the pandemic led to all sorts of changes that, again, would have been impossible otherwise. We had the super fast vaccine development and deployment. You had work from home. You had the shutting down of the mom and pop stores while the big, Walmarts of the world could stay open. And again, a year earlier, if you would have asked anyone if those things would have been possible, they would have laughed at you. And yet, with the right circumstances, with the right chaos, the right pandemic, it greases the skids and gets things done. Now, eventually, I think that the overall goal here is to build some kind of a global culture that replaces all of the individualistic national cultures. I'm not going to go into this now. It's a kind of a deep conspiracy theory. I think there's plenty of evidence for it, but I find it striking that Bernays uses the phrase to bring order out of chaos as the hat tip at the end of the book to kind of tell people in the know that, hey, like, this is how we're going to manipulate people. This is how we're going to bring order out of chaos. This is how we're going to create our global culture. And again, 100 years ago, maybe they only had dreams and aspirations for what has been built today. But as they say, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And Bernays is, putting his brick in the church. He's taking his step on the path to this global monoculture. So this brings us to the end of chapter 11 and also to the end of propaganda. I'm probably going to do one more short overview video, but other than that, it's the end of this book. Now, if you want to see the show notes here, you can find them at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. If you liked the video or you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them below. I'd also love to hear any feedback you have. If you really like this video or the work that I'm doing, you can find a donate button at howtoeatanelephant.xyz. I would not be at all adverse to you pushing that button. And if you don't want to donate or you can't donate, but you want to help me out, you can share this video with anyone you think would be interested in the topic. With all that out of the way, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention and say that I hope you have a good night.